So I'm going to talk to you today about the death of a democracy, the Venezuelan democracy. So last week, Venezuela had the presidential election, and they re-elected President Maduro. So he's the grumpy-looking guy in the corner there with the fantastic mustache. This is his second term. He was the political heir of Hugo Chavez, the mural painting right there. Hugo Chavez was a populist firebrand who was president from 1999 to 2013 when he died of cancer. So they had the presidential election. Maduro won. They came out and they said the media said this was a free and fair election. The government itself said it was a free and fair election. Everybody else around the entire world said this was not a free and fair election. It was a manipulated democracy. Maduro had structured it in a way that he knew he was going to win. And so this is one of the questions I want us to grapple with, is to think about what is going on in Venezuela. Most of us these days are so consumed by American politics, watching the soap opera that is the Trump presidency, that we've missed what's happening in Venezuela. So let me tell you a little bit about it. Venezuela is arguably the most dangerous country in the world right now. On an average day, 73 individuals experience a violent death in Venezuela. Caracas, the capital, is voted the most dangerous city in the world. The murder rate, you can look at the murder rate here, it is skyrocketing. Kidnappings, dramatically up. It is a very dangerous place. And therefore, it's not surprising that you've seen a mass exodus from Venezuela. Early data from 2018 suggested that 5,000 Venezuelans were leaving the country every single day. And for a country of 28 million, that's a lot of people leaving. The other record that Venezuela has is the highest inflation rate. So right now, for March and April of 2018, the inflation rate for Venezuela was 18,000%. So as a comparison, the United States in 2017 was 2. Not 2,000, 2%. So you think about that, that's just an astronomical. It almost doesn't even make sense that the number could be that high. So when you go to the store, the value of the currency is so low that you don't actually count bills, you weigh bills. So you bring in the currency and you weigh it. This is somebody who was buying a pastry and had to put currency down to weigh the actual currency. Speaking of weight, over 3/4 of the Venezuelan population in the last year has lost 19 pounds. That's one statistic that I just find stunning. 3/4 of the population have lost 19 pounds. They call it the Maduro diet. It's like the Atkins diet, but way, way, way worse. So speaking of Maduro, so the president, he gave a speech not too long ago where he was talking about the economic crisis and the struggles that people are going through. He was using very good socialist rhetoric. Don't worry, we'll get through this. And so he was giving this speech on TV, but he knew there were going to be certain times that the camera would look away from him. And so in those moments, he was stuffing his face with empanadas. Now, here's the thing. I don't have a problem with anybody stuffing their face with empanadas. It's a wonderful thing to do. But you can't do that during the middle of a talk when you're telling your people how difficult things are. So here he is looking away. The camera was still on, stuffing his face with empanadas. The other thing to know about this, the Maduro diet, they're using food as a weapon. So during the recent elections, the president said, we're going to give away food boxes. So if you're hungry, if you need food, come. The government will give you a box of food to help. But the thing is, you're going to pick up that food right next to the polling station. So why don't you just come out and vote and then get your food box? And he was not hiding this. He said, I give and you give. You vote for me, and you'll get some food. And you think about that in terms of a democracy absolutely collapsing. It's not the only way that he's manipulating the political process. He's curbed opposition parties, opposition candidates. He has cracked down on any of the public who's pushing back against the government. But maybe the most sinister thing of all is the way in which this repression has curbed speech. People feel uncomfortable to push back against the Venezuelan government. A great example of this is Gustavo Dudamel. Some of you may recognize him. He's fantastic. He conducts the Los Angeles Philharmonic Symphony. He's from Venezuela. He's a major international star. That's not a very good picture of him. That's a better picture of him. Hashtag love that guy's hair. All right. So he has a platform where if he wanted to push back against the Venezuelan government and expose them for the corrupt regime they are, he could do that. And a couple of years have gone by, and he hasn't. And the reason he didn't is that he was afraid that the government was going to crack down on the El Sistema, which, if you don't know, this is this wonderful program in Venezuela where the government provides music and training for students at a very young age, especially poor neighborhoods, where they get exposed to music, classical music. And he knew that if he spoke out against the regime, they would instantly cut this. Well, as time went by, eventually he said, I have to say something. And he did. He criticized the regime. And the next couple of days, they canceled part of the program. They canceled a trip that they were coming to the United States. So it's a repressive regime where they're cracking down. And so for this reason, this is why I would say it's fair to say that last week with those presidential elections, the democracy in Venezuela died. It's not a democracy anymore. And the key question is, how did this happen? Venezuela is a resource-rich country. The best estimates are that it has more oil reserves than any other country in the world. More than Saudi Arabia. That's stunning. It used to be an affluent country. It had money where it was supporting other countries around it. It was the model country in Latin America. Politically, it's never been a perfect democracy, but it was a stable democracy. And countries in the region looked to Venezuela as an example. So how does somebody that was stable, affluent, has lots and lots of resources, how do they collapse to the point where the public is losing 19 pounds in a year? Well, there's a couple easy answers. One, socialism, right? They got the commie cold, right? So they were infected with socialism. And socialism over time undermined the economy and made it not productive. Fair enough. I think that matters. The second easy answer is oil prices. So oil prices, as they plummeted, regimes that are dependent upon oil to fund the regime are in a more difficult situation. Absolutely relevant too. But I would say it's only part of the story. And I think if we really want to understand what's going on in Venezuela and the challenge to democracy today, we need to look at the way in which democracies are bringing about their own demise. And that brings us to what I think is an absolutely fascinating book called How Democracies Die. It came out in 2018 by two Harvard political scientists, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, and they make the argument that what's happening here, if you want to understand democratic declines in Venezuela, in Russia, in Hungary, in Poland, in Turkey, you need to look at the way in which popularly elected Democrats, elected through the democratic process, are slowly and methodically undermining democracy, piece by piece. Almost indecipherable. You don't see that it's happening. And oftentimes with the public's support. That what they're doing is they're dismantling democracy from within. Now that's not how democracies normally die. Democracies normally die at the hands of men with guns, right? Military men. So the second half of the 20th century was militaries coming in and saying, your democracy is done here. No more democracy for you. And that makes sense, right? The military comes in, the democracy crumbles. What we're seeing today, I think, is a different threat. And that's the argument they make, that what's happening is individuals are getting elected to office, in particular, populist demagogues. And what they're doing is they're slowly dismantling that democracy from within. Oftentimes with public support, oftentimes with people not really realizing what's going on. All right, let's think about this from the Venezuelan perspective. To do that, we got to understand President Hugo Chavez. Chavez was democratically elected in 1998. I think that's important. Democratically elected. He ran on a platform of being an outsider. He wasn't part of the political process. He was an outsider. And he was going to challenge and confront the corrupt regime and take them out of power. He spoke for those who didn't have a voice. He spoke for those that were left behind by the economic system. So Venezuela had tremendous economic inequality. And he reached out to ordinary and poor Venezuelans who hadn't done well. And he said to you, I'm going to change your life. I'm going to make things better. It was a very, very receptive audience for that message. When he first came on the political scene, nobody thought he could win. They said, this guy's too odd, he's too unconventional. He says all sorts of crazy things. No way is this guy going to get elected. And then he did. And one of the things about Hugo Chavez is that if you've seen him or see him, he was fantastically entertaining. So one time, when he went to the United Nations, he gave a speech. And this was after the U.S. had invaded Iraq. And the day before at the UN, George W. Bush had given a speech in that exact same spot. And so he walks up there, kind of looks around, and he says, yesterday, the devil was here. You can still smell the sulfur, right? Now, this is the UN. This is diplomacy. Like, everybody loses their mind about this. But a lot of Venezuelans loved this. He was pushing back against the Colossus of the North. He was pushing back against American imperialism. He's entertaining, and people like that about him. The other thing Hugo Chavez knew what to do is he knew how to speak directly to the people. So he created his own TV show. Yeah, his own TV show. Hello, Presidente! It was a weekly TV show. It was a variety show. I'm not joking. The president had a weekly variety show where he would come on and he would sing or he would dance. He would talk about the news. He would interview people. And it was wild, but it was entertaining. Sometimes it would go for an hour. Other times it would go for 5 hours. However long Hugo Chavez wanted to go, that's how long the show was. He would bring members of the government on the show and ask them questions, sometimes grill them, yell at them, why aren't you helping the people? And again, this was going straight into individual audiences. They loved it. My favorite part of the show was one time Hugo Chavez was mad at Colombia. Colombia did something, he was up in arms about this. So he had a member of his military there, and he calls on him. He says, I want you to send troops to the border with Colombia. And the military goes, oh, yes, sir, right away, right? And then 2 days later, a couple days later, he's meeting with the president for Colombia. They're shaking hands, patting each other on the back. He was impulsive. He would say one thing, and then he would do another. You could understand why he was a divisive character. Some people absolutely loved him, and others despised him. In fact, the opposition at one point went to the Supreme Court and said, we need to get some psychologists involved here. Like, we need to bring somebody in and do a psychological analysis because we don't think he's mentally stable to be in office. Didn't happen. But it does bring up an interesting point. I think the real test of a leader, especially a politician in a democracy, is how they respond to the opposition. There's different ways that you can do this. Path A with your opposition is say, well, we disagree on policy. You like one path, or you like one way of pursuing government, I like something else. We can disagree about policy, but I acknowledge your right to exist. I acknowledge that you're a legitimate opposition, and government works better if we're all part of the process. That's path A. Path B is to attack and delegitimize the opposition, say that they're out to undermine the democracy, that they're dangerous, that we got to do something about them, that we can't let those guys get back in power, to delegitimize the opposition. Hugo Chavez took path B. Let me tell you a little bit about what he did. And it was not just attacking opposite politicians, but also institutions that challenged him. So the Supreme Court, so he starts passing some legislation. The Supreme Court pushes back on some of it. He doesn't like this. He dissolves the Supreme Court, which he technically had the power to do. He creates a new Supreme Court. Says, this one's going to be better. And it was a little better, but it wasn't better enough. So then he says, we're going to add more justices to it. So it goes from 20 to 32. He never lost again, right? And he would say, we haven't undermined democracy. We've just brought it a little closer. So you bring the Supreme Court, you pack it with your own supporters. The media. Initially, the media loved Hugo Chavez. They thought he was really entertaining. But then as time went by, the media started to realize he was attacking the democracy. So they started to push back. What does Hugo Chavez do? He attacks the media. He says, you're the enemy of the homeland. You're the enemy of the people. Repeatedly says that, enemy of the people. He says that the media is out there. They're carrying out a military coup. They want to undermine our democracy, delegitimize the opposition, delegitimize the media. There was one television station which he thought was particularly problematic. They were trying to renew their license. He said, no license for you. TV station goes away. Problem solved. The other thing he was famous for was referendum. More and more referendum. Let's get the public voting. Each of these referendum would ultimately pull power away from other institutions and give them to Chavez, making him more and more powerful. And the public continued to vote for it. He was compelling. And over time, all these referendum had pulled more power to him. And what's interesting here is that he used the instruments of democracy to undermine democracy. And as time went by, it only got worse and worse. And when he died in 2013, Maduro took over. He wasn't nearly as charismatic. He wasn't nearly as good of a politician. So he got more extreme. A couple of years ago, when the legislature was taken over by the opposition, he just dissolved the legislature and created a new one. that he packed with all of his supporters. And I think at this point we can say it's not chipping away at democracy, it's taking a sledgehammer to democracy. Essentially, the Venezuelan democracy doesn't exist anymore. And this is a sad and tragic development, and I think that's very, very important. But there's a couple lessons to draw from all of this. One is that democracy is not invincible. Democracy is vulnerable. And in particular, democracy is vulnerable to populists who attack the opposition and try to create an alternative reality that serves their own interest, but not the country's interest. Chavez was wonderful at that. The other lesson to learn is that the economic inequality that was plaguing Venezuela gave the political space for a candidate like Chavez to emerge and seize and take control of that democracy. Because what happened in Venezuela is that a good chunk of the public was supportive of every move he made. That's what's particularly dangerous about our democracy. I guess the final thing I would note is that I wouldn't be surprised if some of you saw some parallels between Venezuela and the United States, and maybe even a few parallels between Hugo Chavez and Donald Trump. I think that's okay, and that should be a little troubling to us. Now, here's the question. Is the United States on the path to Venezuelans' democratic collapse? No. Our democratic institutions are stronger. Our checks and balances are better. There's no question about that. But that being said, I think our democratic alarm bells should be going off. Our democracy is being tested. And I think it's important that both individuals, in a bipartisan way as citizens of the United States, think about that test our democracy is facing. Because it's not inevitable that a democracy always stays strong. Thank you.